North and South Korea were once a unified nation, but now they have become bitter enemies. What exactly happened? It's been over 70 years since the Korean War, and the conflict on the Korean Peninsula has come back into everyone's view. If the two countries were to go to war, what kind of impact would that have on our country? Why did we, even when we were poor and struggling, insist on supporting the Korean War? You'll understand after watching this video. First, let's take a look at the geography of the Korean Peninsula. The Korean Peninsula is located in the eastern part of Asia. It is not only surrounded by the sea on three sides, but also borders three countries. They are Russia in the northeast, China in the northwest, and Japan in the southeast. Korean Peninsula has a total area of 220,800 square kilometers, which is about the same as the area of Hunan in my country, and is almost occupied by two countries. The two countries were once united. Korean Peninsula has ties with our country since ancient times. King Jo of Shang was corrupt, and his uncle Jizi led his people to Korea. In the 1st century AD, Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla emerged. In the 7th century, Silla, aided by the Tang dynasty, unified the peninsula. Internal strife later led to Goryeo rise, which was replaced by the Joseon dynasty in the 14th century, renaming the country Korea. In the early 20th century, Japan targeted Korea for expansion. Joseon was not independent and maintained a tributary relationship with our country. However, in the 1st century AD, three different regimes emerged here: Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla. The situation among these three major powers lasted for several hundred years. It wasn't until the 7th century that the Silla dynasty, with the help of the Tang dynasty, defeated the other two countries and unified the entire peninsula. Later, Silla experienced internal strife and was replaced by Goryeo. By the end of the 14th century, the rise of the Joseon dynasty placed Goryeo and changed the country's name to Korea. However, in the early 20th century, neighboring Japan rapidly rose to power after the Meiji Restoration and embarked on a path of external aggression, with the Korean Peninsula as its primary target. At that time, the Joseon dynasty was not independent and still had a tributary relationship with our country. In order to further achieve its goal of annexing Korea, Japan launched the first Sino-Japanese War against the Qing government. In 1894, the final result was a disastrous defeat for the Qing government, which was forced to sign the infamous Treaty of Shimonoseki. The main content of the treaty was to declare the end of the tributary relationship between China and Korea. Shortly after the Joseon dynasty gained independence on August 29, 1910, Japan launched a large-scale invasion of the Korean Peninsula, leading to Korea becoming a Japanese colony. It wasn't until August 15, 1945, when Japan announced its unconditional surrender, that the Korean Peninsula, which had been colonized by Japan for 35 years, finally welcomed its liberation. But how to achieve liberation at that time was a new question, because World War II had just ended. The world was mainly divided into two camps: the capitalist camp led by the United States, and the socialist camp led by the Soviet Union. Similarly, the Korean Peninsula was divided into two parts. North Korea was occupied by the Soviet Union, while South Korea was occupied by the United States. Both camps had their own interests on the Korean Peninsula, making unification impossible. The only solution was for each side to be independent. Eventually, after discussions between the US and the Soviet Union, it was decided to divide the Korean Peninsula along the 38th parallel. North of the 38th parallel is North Korea, which is supported by the Soviet Union under Kim Il-sung's regime. South of the 38th parallel is South Korea, backed by the United States under Syngman Rhee's regime. From then on, two different types of regimes emerged on the Korean Peninsula, but neither side would back down, and both had aspirations for unifying the peninsula, leading to frequent skirmishes near the 38th parallel. However, as various regions in China continued to be liberated, the global landscape underwent dramatic changes. The Soviet Union saw North Korea as an important foothold in the Far East, and was aware of North Korea's ambition to unify the Korean Peninsula. So they strongly supported North Korea, providing it with a lot of funding and weapons, as well as sending numerous military advisors. This greatly boosted North Korea's confidence. Ultimately, on June 25, 1950, the Korean War broke out. At that time, the United States was more focused on Japan. So in the early stages of the war, the Korean People's Army achieved victory after victory, capturing the South Korean capital, Seoul, and pushing all the way to Busan, taking control of nearly 10,000 square kilometers of land. At this point, the United States began to slowly wake up to the situation. Seeing the regime they supported being bullied, how could they just stand by? So they sent troops to support South Korea and landed in Incheon in the southern part of the Korean Peninsula. Ultimately, the North Korean army, caught in a pincer movement, had to retreat back to the 38th parallel. However, at this point, the US military, disregarding China, repeatedly warned and resolutely crossed the 38th parallel, not only capturing Pyongyang, they also occupied most of Korea. The artillery fire reached near the Yalu River, leading to a significant change in the nature of the Korean War, transforming it from a civil war into an international conflict. In the end, North Korea, feeling cornered, requested support from China, which quickly agreed and rapidly formed the Chinese People's Volunteer Army to join the fight. Thanks to the hard work of these volunteers, they not only won many famous battles, but also defeated the seemingly invincible Americans, pushing both the US and South Korean forces back to south of the 38th parallel. Ultimately, the US military realized they couldn't turn the tide of the war. So on July 27, 1953, both sides signed the Korean War Armistice Agreement. Thus, the 3-year-long Korean War came to an end. This was a war where the weak triumphed over the strong. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army shattered the label of the sick man of East Asia with an iron fist. It also shattered the myth of American invincibility. However, in the early stages of deciding whether to support the Korean War, there was a lot of controversy within our country. At that time, the new China had just been established, was poor and struggling, and had many pressing issues to address. Even just getting enough to eat was a problem, let alone supporting a war in another country. So why did we insist on supporting the Korean War? First, we needed to establish our position internationally. Although we defeated Japan after World War II and became one of the victors, there were differing opinions about China's victory on the international stage. Some countries believe Japan surrendered because the US dropped nuclear weapons. Northeast China faced threats during the American invasion of Korea. The US stationed the 7th Fleet in the Taiwan Strait. China had to participate in the Korean War and win. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army was formed. Cross-border bombings have occurred in our northeast. If North Korea became a US colony, our northeast would be threatened. China had to win the Korean War, forming the Chinese People's Volunteer Army to help Korea win. Recent tensions rose due to a drone incident in South Korea. If war breaks out again, what impact will it have on our country? The international situation is tense, with potential wars in Europe and the Middle East linked to American actions. Taiwan is also about to face a huge threat. Therefore, China had to participate in the Korean War. Not just participate, but win. So, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army was quickly formed to join the fight. And through the hard work of these volunteers, we ultimately helped Korea win the war. For a long time afterward, although there were still political and military differences between North and South Korea, the two countries maintained a relatively friendly and cooperative relationship for a while. However, due to the recent drone incident in South Korea, tensions between the two Koreas have flared up. Now, everyone is wondering, if war breaks out on the peninsula again, what impact will that have on our country? Let's first take a look at the current international situation. Whether in Europe or the Middle East, things are far from peaceful. And there is even a possibility of large-scale wars breaking out, which is closely related to the actions of the Americans. The US hopes to ignite wars in various regions to achieve greater benefits. But the fact is, the US is no longer the invincible America it once was. No advantage gained. East stable, unsettling US, leading to Asia plans. A US tactic to suppress China. War on Korean Peninsula harms China. Russia-Ukraine conflict weakens Europe, increasing US dependence. Europe knows US is unreliable, but complies. Applies to Middle East and Korea. Can't ignore Korean Peninsula war risks. If war threatens, China acts. Even when struggling, we backed Korea. Today, China is stronger, returning to Korea. In the end, it's China that suffers the most. It's like if the Russia-Ukraine conflict continues. Regardless of whether Ukraine wins or loses, the whole of Europe ends up paying the price. This would weaken Europe even more, making it more dependent on the US, which would then further entangle Europe. That's the unfortunate situation for Europe. They know the Americans are unreliable, yet they have to bow down to them. The same logic applies to the Middle East or the Korean Peninsula. So, when it comes to the potential risks of war on the Korean Peninsula, we absolutely cannot turn a blind eye. If war threatens our security, China will definitely not hold back. After all, even when we were poor and struggling, we were willing to go all out to support Korea against the Americans. Moreover, today's China is no longer the China of the past. Now, let's return to the situation on the Korean Peninsula. Looking back at history, it's surprising to find that South Korea and North Korea were originally one country and one nation. They lived together for thousands of years, sharing the same culture and history. Yet in recent decades, they have been forcibly separated. However, as the time apart grows longer, the differences become greater, and the divide deepens. As a result, there is a strong sense of hostility that permeates both official and civilian circles. Along the short 248 kilometers of the 38th parallel, not only are there over 1 million troops stationed, but there are also various radars and artillery spread throughout, making it almost easy to forget that those on either side of the cold barbed wire were once family. Throughout history, no matter the circumstances, the unity and division of a nation have always been eternal topics in this world, whether it's today's North and South Korea, the former East and West Germany, or the relationship between mainland China and Taiwan. If we set aside the complex realities of politics and focus purely on the simple emotions of our people, we sincerely hope that all separated families can reunite. May all estranged brothers reconcile, and all separated siblings reunite. Thank you for watching until the end, and stay tuned for more exciting content in my next episode.